Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I'm going to be trying to tackle building some Martian terrain in this video, which is something I've wanted to do for quite some time. But first, I'm just going to take a minute to talk about this video's sponsor, Into the AM. So, I've got to admit, when the guys over at Into the AM first reached out to me about sponsoring a video, I wasn't so sure. But when I had a chance to check out their huge catalogue of graphic tees, I was pretty blown away. All the designs are really bright and colourful and pretty unique. They really are like their own little pieces of artwork, but what topped this all off for me was the quality. Honestly, I don't think I've been this comfortable when making a diorama for a while. They're made from a super soft material and they fit really nicely, particularly around the arms and the chest. And this particular design, the Cosmic Canyon, is probably my favourite, so this is going to be the inspiration for the build in this video. So if comfort's your priority, and you want to look pretty cool at the same time, check out Into the AM and get 10% off your entire order using my link in the description. So to start this piece off, we're going to be using a photo frame for the base, and 10 points to anyone who figured that out already. I mean, I probably sound like a broken record at this point, but they're pretty cheap and really easy to use. It doesn't take a lot of effort to get a nice sturdy base to start building on top of. We just need to remove any unnecessary pieces and quickly knock back the finish on the frame just so the hot glue sticks a little bit better. I'm going to be using some packing foam to build up the groundwork on this piece. This isn't anything fancy, just some polystyrene that you'd find in your everyday packaging. And once that was all locked in, I used the hot wire cutting table to remove any excess and trim down the edges. Then I came in with my trusty Sharpie and started to roughly plan out how I wanted the landforms to look and flow. And once I was happy, I could use the hot wire foam cutter to start removing material. I didn't have any sort of grand plan for this step, I just loosely followed the markings that I'd already laid out. And once I was happy with the gentle slope in the terrain, it was time to move on to the canyon walls. Or wall in this case. For this section of the terrain, I'm going to be using some XPS foam that I've stacked up into a bunch of layers. This stuff's a lot denser than the polystyrene and it's going to be perfect for carving in a rock face. I just needed to cut it to match the rest of the terrain and then we were ready to start carving. I start by scoring in a whole bunch of lines running in the same sort of direction in the face of the foam, whilst making sure not to lose any digits in the process. Next it was time to start removing random pieces of foam with some long nose pliers. The pliers help make this step a little easier because you can pull and tear away the pieces of foam. And then to push the look a little further, I used the back end of a Sharpie to push down some of the pieces of foam to create some even deeper crevices. Then I could come in with a pretty dull X-Acto blade and etch in some more detail. And because the blade isn't that sharp, it's going to pull and tear the foam, which isn't a problem because it's only going to add to that irregular, natural look. And after scrubbing away any loose pieces of foam with a stiff brush, I thought the rock face was still looking kinda square, so I decided to remove the top section, just to make it flow a little bit better with the groundwork. And then for the final round of detail, I used a real rock that I think I found in my garden, to press in some more of that irregular detail. And then the canyon wall was ready to be locked into place with a few dabs of hot glue. But this piece of foam on its own wasn't going to be quite enough detail for this piece, so it was on to modelling some fallen rocks. And for that, I'm going to use some bark. I really like to use this landscaping bark when I get a chance because it's got a really nice natural texture to it. And in quite a short amount of time you can build up a pretty convincing looking scene. Plus it's really nice and easy to work with and it takes paint really well, you just need to lock it in place with a little bit of hot glue. And before you know it, I'm ready to move on to the next step, which was to fit the fascia with some construction card. I did this step off camera because, like I said before, it's not the most entertaining thing to watch. But that did mean we were ready to move on to the next step, which was to fill in some of those gaps by first mixing up a small batch of sculptor mould. Sculpt mold's going to be great for this step because it's got enough body to it that it's going to hold its shape enough to fill in all of those gaps, but at the same time it's going to dry with a nice natural looking texture. I use an old paintbrush just to push it into place and smooth it out just enough to make for some natural looking transitions. And in not too much time at all, I'm ready to give all the foam an extra layer of protection with some terrain paste. This mix of matte Mod Podge, plaster and paint is going to give all the foam a little bit of protection from the paint, and at the same time it's also going to give it a really nice natural texture. I just need to make sure to mix it thin enough so it's spreadable with a brush. And once I had good coverage and the terrain paste was still a little bit wet, I could then come in and start adding some more layers of texture. I started by adding in a bunch of these decorative stones that I picked up from a garden centre. Then I followed this up with some fallen rocks from Geek Gammy Scenics. I tried to just concentrate on applying it around the bigger stones and towards the base of the cliff. Then it was a layer of fine sand that just got applied around all of the fallen stones. And then a final layer of tile grout, particularly around the front, just to finish off. And once I removed any unwanted tile grout from the top of the larger rocks, I could then lock everything into place with some isopropyl alcohol and some scenic cement from Woodland Scenics. And after a few hours of drying time, we were almost ready to apply some paint. But first, I thought it might be a cool idea to try and add some cracked earth effects using this technical paint from Games Workshop. This Agrellan earth is pretty much just a coloured crackle paste, and it's going to be perfect for this situation, but any other brand of crackle paste would do the same job here. I just make sure that when I apply the paint, I apply it in a variation of thicknesses, and then I use a little water on the end of the brush just to feather out the effect around the edges. Hopefully, this means that when it's had a few hours to dry, we're going to get a nice variation in cracks, some big, some small. Then after quickly painting the sides with some black gesso, I could move on to the first layer of primer. For the first layer, I use some of Vallejo's polyurethane black primer, and I follow this up with a second highlighting layer with some of Vallejo's white primer. And then our Martian terrain was ready for some much needed colour, and I'm going to start out by base coating all of the rocks with some of this fur brown from the Army Painter. This first layer of paint is all about locking in a nice uniform base colour. Then we can come in with some more colours to start applying some highlights and some extra detail. My first layer of highlighting is going to be done with this orange brown from Vallejo. I'm just going to concentrate on applying this to the higher points across the rocks just to add a little bit more visual interest and some transitions through the colour. And once I had a little more contrast over the rocks, I could then block out the rest of the groundwork using some of Vallejo's tan earth. So once I'd finished blocking out the main colours, it was then time to bring back some of the finer details by painting a few of the stones individually. I just laid down a few of the colours I'd already used, plus some Iraqi sand, to mix up a few different tones that I could apply over a handful of the stones. And once I was happy / had enough of painting individual stones, I moved on to applying some shadows with some enamel brown wash. I mixed the wash up into a fairly thin consistency just so I could get it to flow a little better, and when applying it I concentrated it a little heavier in most of the shadowed areas. And I know what you're probably thinking at this point.
But Chris, this is starting to look more like desert terrain, not a Martian landscape. Are you okay?
And yeah, at this point you'd probably be right to think that, but I have got hold of some nice pigment powders that are hopefully going to do most of the heavy lifting for us, so we're just going to have to trust in the process. And once all the enamel wash was dry, I then come in and reinforce some of the shadows with some Agrex Earthshade, before hitting the whole piece with some matte varnish to lock in the paint job. And after dry brushing the high points on the rocks with some Iraqi sand, it was then time to go ahead and apply the pigment powders to try and achieve that dusty Martian look. And I'm going to be using this Rust and Corrosion pigment set from Vallejo because there's some really nice orangey brown colours in there, and hopefully this is going to give us that nice dusty look that we're after. But when it comes to applying the pigments, I'm actually a little bit heavy handed. This is because I'm not really too worried about the amount that's on there at the moment. as I want all the colours to kind of mix together when I apply them properly with a brush. But I start off with randomly applying a few spots of rust and old rust around the surface of the terrain. Then I can come in with a soft dry brush and start to push the pigment into the groundwork. Then I could get in touch with my inner crime scene investigator and dust the rest of the pigment powder across the terrain with a soft makeup brush. And to create a few darker spots, I use some brown iron oxide pigment in a few random areas. I followed these same steps along the top and the front of the rock face before locking it all down and activating the pigment with some isopropyl alcohol. But now all the landscape was finished, we still needed to have our lonely astronaut wandering through the Martian terrain, so it was time for a little bit of 3D printing. I managed to find a really cool looking STL online for this astronaut, so if you're interested, I'll pop a link down in the description so you can check it out for yourself.
2 hours later.
And once the 3D printer had finished doing its thing, I was left with this cool looking little astronaut. And I don't really know why, but I think I'm going to call him Matt. And once I'd got Matt ready for paint, I took a minute just to figure out how I was going to start this paint job. And I think the best place to start is going to be with a deep browny red for the base coat. And I'll mix up that colour with a little more of that fur brown from the army painter with a touch of red. I start by applying the first layer of paint in a thin down glaze. That way I can still take advantage of the highlighting layers that I added with the primer. And after about 4 or 5 layers, I was ready to apply the first round of highlights. And I thought it would be a good idea to stick to the same colours I used on the terrain, so the first layer of highlights was some orange brown from Vallejo. I just concentrated on applying this across most of the high points, mainly on Matt's left hand side. And then the second layer of highlights was some cobalt skin from the army painter. And this was applied in the same way as the first layer, but just not quite applying as much paint this time. Then it was on to painting Matt's backpack, or his primary life support system. I started by base coating the entire thing and his helmet with some of Vallejo's neutral grey. And then I added in a final layer of highlights across the whole of the backpack and the left side of his suit with some of the army painter's stone golem. Then to create those shadows, it was time to apply some washes. I went with some dark tone from the army painter for his backpack, and then finished off the rest of the suit with some Agrax Earthshade. And once all the washes were dry, I could then come in and paint his visor with some antique gold from Darkstar. And after reapplying some of the highlights that were lost after the wash, our buddy Matt was pretty much ready to be fitted to the base. He just needed some of that pigment powder dusted over his feet, and then I could permanently fit him into place. And I thought, for a change, it might be a nice idea to finish this piece off with a plaque. There's plenty of space along the section at the front here, so it might make for a nice little addition. It didn't take too much effort to design one in Tinkercad, and as soon as I had it printed out, I primed it black and finished it off with some more of that antique gold. Then I fitted it into place with a little bit of super glue, and I think Matt was just about ready for his final glamour shots. So I think I'm now going to leave Matt to try and find his way home. And I just want to take a minute to say thank you everybody for watching. The channel's just hit 10k subs, which is actually mind blowing, so thank you each and every one of you for your continued support. I really couldn't have done it without you. And thanks again to Into the AM for sponsoring this video. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.